Hey, Winston, thank you for coming in. I was just
Yes,
looking at your background, like you're an investor, an attorney, an author of best-selling books. You're in venture capital and things like that. Currently on all these different boards of companies and European
there's a
tech
few.
and
Mhm.
New York University Law School, and it's kind of goes on and on. I mean, it's just a tremendous amount of accomplishment for somebody so young, by the way. So thank you for coming in and sharing all of your experiences with our audience, or at least a small portion of it, anyways.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously you have a lot to share too. Yeah.
So, Winston, my
Mm.
audience is really quite diverse, a lot of CEOs. And in fact, when I
Mm.
post an interview in LinkedIn or something, the number one readership is actually CEOs and investors and founders.
Terrific.
And there's board members. And later in the list, there may be professors or something like that. But typically,
Hmm.
it's very senior, very senior leaders that are who can kind of consume what I do. And the interviews appear in tech channels, so we're going to have to add elements of tech in there and things like that. But you cover it all, anyways.
Mm.
And my audience is always curious. You've got such a tremendous history of accomplishment, and you're still really, really young. What were the drivers of this? I mean, was it like when you were 3, 10, something that happened when you're in college, or maybe some early successes, mentors, two or three really change makers in your life that made this wonderful person that's out there today?
Really interesting question. I attended and spoke at many different conferences, podcasts, but this is a kind of unique question. Actually, you made me to think. So that's a really good one. I would say maybe the first one, but you can relate to this. It is because my interest in physics, and actually my first degree undergrad was in physics. So so the so the so the the, the, the physics way of thinking, right, of looking at a complex system, complex world, and then try to figure out a simple way to describe it and make sense of it. And of course, you ignore a lot of details, but you get the gist of it. I think that probably has a very big impact on me overall, right? So the physics part of it, and I think another aspect is just like the personal interest in science in general. So science in general, uh, but uh, but did not kind of just sort of going that way, kind of single-minded. Obviously, like for the Nobel Prizes people, they have to focus on one thing, right? But in my case, I had that physics training, but I went to law school. Maybe that was a very big transition in my life at very young. After my undergrad in physics, I went to law school. Actually, I was a top student in the material science major, so it wasn't clear to people why I did that, right? But to me, it was a very interesting time to look into that direction, because at that time China had no lawyer system yet. China just started to have bar exams. Believe it or not, in the early 1990s. After many years of kind of without a legal system, right? China restarted the bar exam for lawyers, and then tried to create a legal system. And even more importantly, right, the intellectual property law just came into the scene. So I thought, hey, maybe I should become the first generation of tech lawyer in China. Of course, it was the right idea too early. Like today, IP lawyer is a very big thing in China. But at that time, right, it was still very early. But I managed to go into the direction of capital markets. I become a capital markets lawyer at Davis Polk, and then from there become a capital markets banker at JP Morgan and the Barclays Capital. Before I went to CIC, to work on global investments in the capital markets, right? So I feel like that the willingness to try something drastic, from undergrad in physics into law school for graduate studies, probably was a good thing. Probably was a very good thing for me to open my mindset, right, to go into different directions. And maybe the third one was at my MBA studies. After 3 years with Davis Polk, the leading securities law firm on Wall Street, because of my quantitative background, I wanted to go in something more quantitative. So I went to B school and a plan to go into the finance market, right? And during the school time, I started a financial derivatives club. Michigan had a finance club for many years, right? But they never had a financial derivatives club. And you at that time, Steve, you remember at the beginning of 2020, at the beginning of the new century, right? Financial derivatives was still a very big thing, and even Enron was at its beginning, right? So that was a very good time to start a club, and to me, that was a test of my leadership skill, to found something. And I choose it to do the B school, as you can see, right? It is a very low risk environment. It's a very low risk environment. So I choose to start something in a low risk environment just to see if I can do it. And then that was a good timing. Financial derivatives were really hot. All the investment banks wanted to sponsor my club. So very quickly, I attracted a lot of students, including students outside of the B school, like from even as far as like a geography department, guys want to come in. So that was an interesting test of myself. And I use that, just to gain some confidence that I can be an entrepreneur myself, even though I had a lawyer background.
That's kind of fascinating. You have a degree in physics and you're a top student, and then you decided to go get a degree in law, and people are wondering, why are you doing that?
Exactly.
Because you got such a quantitative background. And then you decide to work with some of the top firms in the US, and then you go to get your MBA from the University of Michigan, the Ross Business School, and you start a finance club, and it's like never done before. So you get people all sorts of interested in that, and then you end up in getting a master's of law from New York University, right? So School of Law, and you end up being a Hauser Global Scholar.
Yes. So that was my first stop in the States. So I still feel very indebted, to New York University and the US in general. I got to the scholarship from Hauser Foundation. So right after my Chinese law school, I can come here in 1997, to study at NYU for 1 year with the 1 year full scholarship, which completely changed my life. Actually, when I got on the plane to New York, that was my first time to travel abroad, and frankly, it was my first time to get on a plane, Steve. So the scholarship from NYU and the States, really changed my life. That was a very big thing. I started my career at Davis Polk, also benefited from that, right? And then from there on, I could test different things, in a much less risk environment, to try and get into different directions, try different paths.
Yeah, and again, it's fascinating. In fact, you were also nationally certified software programmer in the 90s. So,
yes,
physics to software programmer to law school to starting
MBA.
finance, the MBA, and now an adjunct professor at New York School of Law, and you specialize in things like sovereign funds. Can you talk about that? What got you interested in really teaching about sovereign funds in this New York environment?
Oh, terrific. After 10 years Wall Street lawyer and banker experiences, right, I got the chance to join CIC at its very beginning as the first group of overseas hires. the U.S. educated, Wall Street educated Chinese, right, to go back to the China government fund to manage a portion of the massive foreign reserve. Today CIC has become a one trillion plus institution. When I started there, in the first year of CIC, it started with 200 billion US dollar cash for global investing. So that was a great platform for me to get into the global capital markets and to work on the buy side after many years on the sell side of the Wall Street, right? So I had long story short, I had 10 years with CIC. Met lots of global peers, sovereign funds in Southeast Asia or Middle East, and for public pensions, from Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, right? All these sovereign investors, I got to know them really well, especially because I had 4 years. 4 years I was based in Toronto, Canada, as the first managing director for CIC's overseas office. Believe it or not, the Toronto office back in 2011 to 2015 was the first overseas office of CIC. So because of that, I got into a really close relationship with the Canadian pensions. All these, gave me a very good background and network to start this adjunct professor class at NYU Law School after I left the CIC and returned to New York in 2019. So it's really good to do it in New York, Steve. To your question, a couple of reasons. One is because NYU Law School, right, being in New York, it's a very much a capital markets driven law school. So I got lots of students interested in the capital markets topic, and for that, the sovereign funds and public pension funds, as the largest asset owners, are becoming the frontier of the capital markets, right? So that attracted a lot of students' interests. And another important factor is that New York is the home to lots of sovereign funds and pension funds North America office, right? Even though CIC started North America office in Toronto, for most of them, for most of the sovereign funds, pension funds, they have their office in New York. So for my class, I can always engage senior people from their New York office, if not from their headquarters, to come as guest speakers. And even for sovereign funds that have functions out of the headquarters, right? So for example, for ESG topics, Norwegian sovereign fund, the largest sovereign fund of the world with 1 trillion plus dollars of assets, right? They have their ESG policy mostly from their headquarters, but still they have the New York office, right? So their chief risk officer is willing to fly to New York to speak at my class, but for the same week he can work from the firm's New York office. So it was a great setup for me to engage the executives of the biggest, most powerful sovereign funds and pension funds to speak in my class, and I think that's really a treat to the young law school students, plus some Stern business school students, because the class is open to Stern business school as well.
Well, your course or your current course is Sovereign Investments and Regulations, right? So it's a perfect course, or has its course name changed?
Yes. No, that it is. So essentially, you see developments on both sides. So the sovereign funds, as we know it, right, has become tremendously active, has been increasingly active since they showed up in the global scene back in the financial crisis 2008, Steve. Citibank, right, Morgan Stanley, they all received billions of dollars from the largest sovereign funds, including CIC, to survive the 2008 financial crisis. So that could be viewed as like the beginning of the sovereign funds coming to the front line of the capital markets. And these days, they become more and more active, right? instead of putting most of the money into investment funds, they want to be the direct investors themselves. So these days, it's hard to miss headlines of sovereign funds getting into new deals, from infrastructure to real estate, to from healthcare companies to even football clubs, right? During the pandemic, Saudi sovereign fund put money into UK club. That's another way to get the assets cheap. And the most relevant is they become the new VC, Steve. Just like you and me, right? They become the new venture capitalists. They want to go into direct investments, and they want to do it more and more early, even at the early stage phase of the tech venture companies, right? So they become increasingly active in investments. That's one hand, right? On the other hand, from the regulation side, right, they are increasing assertiveness in the global capital markets, also gets the attention of the global regulators, right? Especially for the countries that are receiving their investments. Now the tech space is the frontier, right? So on one hand, you see the sovereign funds are becoming the new VC. At the same time, right, you see more and more countries, including the US, Europe, UK, Australia, as you can imagine, they develop a regulatory framework to review the investments from these sovereign investors, especially in the advanced tech space, right? Because these countries want to welcome foreign capital, but they also want to protect their intellectual property. So that's why investments and the regulation are the two important aspects of my class on sovereign fund topics.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. As you mentioned, a lot of the sovereign funds have some kind of presence in New York, and they will come to your class, like the Norwegian sovereign fund, which is one of the most capitalized in the world today, right? If not number one. So, and they'll say, yes, Winston, we'll speak to your class.
Yes.
I can see why you're a member of the New York University President's Global Council since its founding in 2013.
Yes.
And in 2014, you received the NYU Distinguished Alumni Award because you are so out there bringing attention to the university, right, in your work.
Yeah, obviously I was really humbled by the NYU Alumni Award because to me, in the very first time, I was very lucky to become a NYU student in the first place, right? Because I really needed it in the early days, in the early 19th of China, right? I really needed the full scholarship from the Hauser Foundation to spend a year at the NYU Law School and pass the New York bar. Like without the scholarship, nothing could have happened, right? So I really feel tremendously indebted, to NYU Law School and the university as a whole. And it was interesting because the law school dean that time, when I was at the law school, was John Sexton. And after I graduated, I started Wall Street career. Actually, he also moved up to become the university president, right? Because he really had this vision of quote unquote global university. He wanted to use NYU taking advantage of the New York City advantage to build up a global university, and he truly did. He after NYU Washington Square, he also set up two quote unquote portal universities, the NYU Shanghai and the NYU Abu Dhabi. The NYU Abu Dhabi, interestingly, was sponsored by the sovereign fund of UAE, namely Mubadala. So they sponsored the NYU AD University concept, and the portfolio, one of the portfolio company of Mubadala, a major construction company locally, was the main constructor of the campus. So that was a good sovereign fund story there. But also NYU Shanghai, right? And when it is called a portal university, that means when a student comes into NYU through Shanghai, Abu Dhabi, or New York, Washington Square Park campus, they are all the same. They're all the same. For students to go to NYU Shanghai, they will get the same diploma as a student coming to NYU New York campus. So that's that for NYU Shanghai, that was a unique campus in China. Like lots of foreign universities may have exchange program in China, but they do not have the full curriculum program in China. To provide the same diploma to the Chinese students and global students, attending NYU through the Shanghai campus. So I think the global presence, the President's Global Council that started with John Sexton was really a reflection of the concept of a global university. He said we're going to turn NYU into a global campus. Not just a U.S. university with lots of exchange programs overseas, but really global presence. With three major presence in Shanghai, Abu Dhabi, and in New York, and the students can move around smoothly among these campuses, as well as other satellite campuses. So they can really get a global education. I fully believe in that. Concept because I benefited from working in many different parts of the world, right? Beijing, Shanghai, Toronto, New York. So when you spend time really working or studying at the different parts of the world, right, you become a truly global citizen, and that's really needed for the global economy right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I can always see these New York roots, right? I mean, you were the deputy head of the equity capital markets of Barclay Capital, which you mentioned earlier. You were vice president at JP Morgan Investment Banking, and a corporate lawyer at Davis Polk and Wardwell. And interestingly, in 2013, you were selected as a young global leader at the World Economic Forum. So all of these accolades and senior positions. What were some of your learnings from the senior positions based out of the West, out of New York, and from the World Economic Forum?
Oh, fascinating question. Really, really great questions too. I think the implication of Davos on me has been quite profound, frankly. Obviously people have different views about Davos, right? But I have come to a few interesting learning, after a few trips there, when I was still relatively young, right? Because for young global leader, you needed to be nominated before age 40. And there's another group of shapers, you need to be nominated before age 30. But for YGL, right? So you get nominated before 30, and then before age 40, and then you go through a review process, and then you will be adopted, right? And you have 5 years as a young global leader, which give you quite a bit of privilege to attend Davos events, which is different from a corporate member, right? Where people get tickets through corporate membership. Now, I got a few interesting learning from this process. The first one is that it is about from time to time you need to be you need to go into such a gathering, maybe not Davos, but you need to be into a gathering of global leaders. That was lesson number one to me. I touched many majors, right? So I think I get into many different areas, but the data explosion, is in recent years, right, has really been real and accelerating. So in order to like to understand what's going on, you have to go to these global leader gathering and try to find ways to be there. Like when I look around, you see those people much more senior and even people much more senior, large corporation CEOs, etc. Right? They know a lot already from their own ecosystem, right? But when you meet them at Davos, you can feel like they have antenna all over their body, like absorb information, try to get to the latest of everything. They learned a lot, from that. Like you can see that how important it is to get into gatherings of global leaders just to stay in the game, right? So that's one important thing. And then the second is about relating to the first one, actually. The second thing is about like making impact. Like how do you make impact? We have gone a long way in the career, and we certainly hope during the limited time of our career life, we can make some positive, lasting impact, either in the society or in the industry, right? Then I realized that why do we need some gathering like Davos? Because we have a lot of blind spots, and then just to put small people together and exchange ideas, and so that everyone can be aware of the presence of others, can be aware of the presence of new ideas, new developments. That's a tremendous value in it, and from there, like you can develop the ideas, to have impact in a much more macro way, versus you just think from your own world. Say, like I'm in this industry, I try to do something here. So to me, the Davos concept really makes sense, and it has implication on me because since I joined like 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, right? I think that way of thinking has been in my mind always. Like try to find the global leaders, mingle with them, not necessarily in the same industry, but really truly like a smart, thoughtful people, so that you can develop the latest thinking about everything, with them.
I can see then, it's quite transformational in your growth and being amongst an international community where you're sharing ideas and you're especially selected because you're leading. You're always at the boundaries, so that expands your point of view and the relationships and the friendships you form. And
Yes.
you now YGL alumni, right? Because you've grown beyond the age limit, but I know there's an alumni, and
Yes.
that's like a community, and you become friends for life. Do you continue to reach back into the YGL, the Young Global Leader community, to do things and so on?
Yes.
You still need.
Yes, it's totally a influential society, I would say. To me, the biggest impact is to see guys working on things that I never thought of. And that's probably especially true for the emerging, the YGLs from the emerging markets. Like in my day-to-day Wall Street, right, or finance world, right, I can meet lots of developed markets leaders quite naturally. But for emerging markets, right, these guys have been a window for me, and it's truly fascinating to see that they're working on things that I never thought of. Especially the emerging markets YGLs that are working on NGOs, they try to they try to leverage the network of Davos to bring resources, to their respective countries, and then to try to cultivate the social change. So to them, right, to them, when they look at the new technology developments, they think about the potential social impact, or think of that as a new enabler to initiate social changes in their countries. Very, very impressive. Very, very. Yeah. So to me, that was a window to a world that I'm less familiar with, and so I stay in touch with many people. It's interesting to follow their developments. When I think about the China market, when I think about China markets having lots of cases of technology leapfrogging, actually they have even more drastic examples. That's really exciting.
So what I'm hearing then is, you meet these young global leaders, and really the ones that are particularly noteworthy in your mind, because you're always around Western style developed nations, young global leaders. When you get the ones from the developing nations, it's really interesting how they're trying to have impact, and they're taking technologies and other solutions into their environments, and that's where the leapfrogging can occur, right? So
totally.
And then
that's a great point.
Yeah, and then that have profound impact within their societies and so on. You're also the co-founder and managing partner of a venture capital firm, and you're involved in interactive entertainment companies. What does that mean?
Yes.
What is interactive? I know what they are, but the audience may
Yeah.
not know what that means. So what does that mean?
Yes. No, for anyone who has gone through the initial internet, right? Then it's very clear to people there are three phases of internet development. At the end of last century, most people got into internet through emails and .com websites. Just read about these websites, right? At the time, people cannot do anything about it, right? You are just a reader. Actually, you don't know how you can contribute, how you can create your own internet or something, right? But at the new century, I call it 2006 or 2007-ish, right? When you have a social network, Facebook, and online entertainment come up, then you can get, then you can participate. And then it's sort of the start of this interactive concept, right? So for average internet users, they're no longer mere readers of websites. Instead, they can be content creators themselves. And this trend has been accelerated by the mobile internet and a smartphone, right? So that anyone, anytime, anywhere can be part of the internet activities. They can, an average user, right? They can watch a YouTube video, but at the same time, they can create their own YouTube video, right? They can comment on other people's video, but they can also welcome other people's involvement in their own creation. So that's the concept of interactive entertainment. Now, there's the third phase is this metaverse concept, right? When Facebook changed its name from Facebook into Meta, Facebook want to emphasize that we are going to there's the third phase, right? It's like a three-dimensional interactive. So you can put on AR, VR, XR devices, get into the virtual space in a three-dimensional context, and you can develop an avatar of yourself or 3D video version of yourself, and that virtual representative you can be active in the 3D space, interact with other avatars or or other holograms, 3D images. So that's really the essence of interactive entertainment. The average user can be content creators, and from two-dimensional pictures and videos, we are going to three-dimensional, 3D video or gaming, 3D virtual AR, VR, XR space. So to me, the interactive entertainment is going into a new breakout time, just like last time when we introduced the social network and two-dimensional video picture sharing, revolutionized average internet users.
So are you investing in things like volumetric technology or
Yes.
you are. So
yes. Actually, great question, Steve. Recently we just announced that we did a 3D year for VC space, but we managed to lead this 11 million round for Arcturus, with Epic Games and Autodesk, these industry companies involved in the same round. So it's a still early stage. The three-dimensional video requires a lot of data processing power, right? It is very difficult to transmit. Even with the current infrastructure, maybe 5G network will help it even better, right? So right now, the 3D video technology is about how to compact the data and transmit the data efficiently, kind of a software play. We are still a few months away, from true 3D live broadcasting. Maybe a few years from now, maybe a few months from now, or maybe a year from now, right? We will start to see people doing live broadcasting with 3D video effect versus people exhibiting themselves on TikTok with two-dimensional video.
Yeah, but then the devices at the consumer side will have to be able to resolve that data in a way that's immersive, right? So
that's right. So maybe smartphone is not the device, or maybe we will see revolution in smartphone, and also maybe we need advanced cloud computing technology, right? So that even basic smartphone can handle that kind of data processing through the help of cloud ecosystem.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of excitement over the existing companies, like Google and Microsoft and Meta, of course, and then
right.
Apple. There's a lot of speculation about Apple's AR VR device, right, or XR device, and what that's going to look like. And
exactly,
it's been delayed. So people are saying, well, and would that be a game changer? Like, I've got an Apple Ultra watch.
Yes,
and it's pretty amazing all the things it can do, right? So
sure.
So you're an investor in that space, and it's an exciting space. You're also the chairman of a Nasdaq European tech company, and you're Nasdaq listed. Can you talk about that company a little bit?
Yeah. It's Nasdaq listed, so I keep it very brief because I'm the board chairman, and you have to comply with SEC disclosure rules relating to public listed companies. And obviously another reason is because it's a really challenging time for the SPAC space.
Yeah, for sure.
So I wouldn't say too much, until the deal is completely crystallized. But a long story short, the SPAC was listed last November on Nasdaq. MCAA is the ticker, and I teamed up with a Zurich-based European PE VC fund which is called Mountain Partners. We put the SPAC together, and that's why the name of the SPAC, right, the ticker is MCAA, Mountain Acquisition Corporation. The current situation of the SPAC market is that the financing market is under pressure due to the rate hikes by the Federal Reserve, right? So the overall financing market is very challenging. So after the SPAC is listed, the SPAC needs to acquire a target to complete the transaction, right? Essentially to bring a non-listed company into the shell company, the SPAC, and turning the shell company, the SPAC, into a real listed company with real corporate businesses, right? And for that acquisition, right, the finance market is very challenging, and at the same time, the SEC has tightened up the SPAC rules, right? So you have to deal a lot more SPAC-related disclosure and other securities laws. So the overall process has become a lot more complex as compared to the SPAC market a year ago. So wish me good luck to complete that transaction, Steve.
Yeah, but it would be helpful because you're a lawyer too, right?
Oh, well, yeah, exactly. I will think about my my board chairman liability on the board. No, but that's joking. It's exciting process. The only thing, the one thing that makes me feel more comfortable about this SPAC is that we focus on European market. So it's a SPAC with slightly different focus, as compared to many other SPACs. So we may have advantage in the European market to find the right target for the right transaction.
That's fascinating. You're also a board member of the International Data Center Authority. Can you talk about that?
Yes. No, IDCA is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And as a former lawyer, I always think IDCA sort of started as the bar association of the data center and the cloud computing professionals, right? Because IDCA also sets up industry standards, for data center, cloud computing, etc. And IDCA provides training, education modules, right? And it also certifies individuals, as data center experts, etc. And for professionals in that space, right? When they get to the IDCA certification, they go to work for the cloud business of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, etc. So it started, like you can think of this like the association of the data center people, right? Or the CFA Society of cloud computing people, things like that, right? In addition to the standards, certification, and education part, that ecosystem has a huge amount of industry veterans in that space. So from that ecosystem, I can learn about the latest data center technologies. So these days, for example, cooling technologies, right? Cooling technologies for data center has become a key ESG consideration. So I'm learning a lot of data center technologies from IDCA, and also I'm also helping them to get into data center digital infrastructure transactions, leveraging my expertise in the capital markets.
That's quite fascinating. There's a lot of tech in that space too, right? Especially because of data power consumption. And I did an interview with Philip Wong at Stanford, and new kinds of chip technologies to try to reduce the power consumption and things like that. You're an advisory board member of Capgemini. Capgemini is quite a famous company. So
yes,
what's that experience like? And any insights that you can share? I'm sure a lot you can't, but maybe there's some insights you can share from that work.
Actually, to your point, yes, it's a great company, and just as much as try to share my perspectives to the company, I'm also taking advantage of the advisor board to learn about the latest from the perspective of Capgemini, as well as from the fellow board members, advisor board members, because we have senior executives from Microsoft, T-Mobile, Meta, Vodafone, a bunch of global companies executives. They are also on the advisor board. So as I said, right, as much as try to provide my unique perspectives, for example, the China market or the metaverse side, because my involvement with the VC space, etc. Right, I'm learning a lot, from this experience myself, because for Capgemini, they have been a leading system integrator on the cloud, right? They have been this important bridge between cloud service providers and large corporate IT users, right, who try to adopt the latest software. Most of them are cloud-based into their day-to-day operations, right? Whether it's banks or corporations, right? They're going through this cloud transformation, and it's between the corporate clients or bank clients and the cloud service providers like Amazon, Microsoft, right? Capgemini plays a very, very important role to be the system integrator, and during the process, they understand the cloud ecosystem really, really well. And so to me, this Capgemini experience is a great window, into the latest tech adoption, by the corporate world.
So Winston, we talked about your physics background. You were nationally certified as a software developer. You got an MBA. You in finance. You got multiple degrees in law. You're a professor at NYU. You won a lot of recognition as being top in this, or and third-party recognition, like the Young Global Leader from the World Economic Forum, and you worked with some of the biggest capital market kind of companies in New York, like Barclays and JP Morgan and so on. And then we hear about all of this other board programs and investment programs that you're part of. So you're really at the confluence of the digital, physical, and biological worldwide. So now we're going to shift our direction in the last few questions.
Sure.
Where do you see the world going from a technology standpoint? So do you think, for example, technology will become sentient, or in some way, not human sentience, let's say just that's a separate category, but have some kind of intelligence that's non-human, but yet has intelligence, just like octopus have a distributed network. It's not like our intelligence, but there's some intelligence there, right? Or corvids, which are things like blackbirds and others, they have some kind of intelligence. They can problem solve. A bird brain is problem solving, right? Or
yes,
or you get other sort of phenomena occurring, and there's some kind of intelligence. Do you think technology, and not 100 years from now or 1,000, I'm talking 10 years from now, think that AI, and there's a lot of excitement in the news today on
exactly
on this thing from OpenAI called Chat GPT, right?
Yes.
People are just so excited about it, right? I think they've onboarded more than 1 million users in a really short period of time, and that's an outgrowth of a GPT-3 and things like that, and there's Dolly 2, and
totally.
So do you think in 10 years we're going to have some kind of assistant, and you're going to be to converse with, and you won't know that it's non-human, and it'll seem human in many respects, though it's another kind of intelligence. Do you think that's going to happen or not?
Yeah, no, you're more expert on that topic than I do, but so as I just try to sort of speaking from a earlier physics mindset person, right? So, the physics mindset is that the more you understand it, the more humble you become in front of the nature. I could understand why Newton, like the hero of physics, right, especially classical physics, in his later years will believe in God and really acknowledge the limit of the human. So I think when you look at the physics, right, you come up with beautiful formula, and you can really understand a few things very nicely. But the world, right, has so much more mysteries that physics cannot explain. Cannot develop a beautiful formula to explain it. So I think the way you frame it is probably correct. Is that we may see some intelligence to develop in a limited fashion, right? But to completely replace people, probably they're not there because the human world is just so much more complicated, especially when you have interactive, right? We're back to the interactive discussion. Especially when you have human to human interaction, I think it will be really hard for machine formula and data statistics to replicate. So the way I look at it, I have been impressed by the development of the AI, especially relating to the deep mind and its algorithm to play the Asian Go chess, right? The Go chess was believed to have more variations than the total number of atoms in the universe, right? But within a few years, right, DeepMind, now part of Google, can develop a AI to become an expert on that game and even beat the best human player in the world, right? And it's worth noting DeepMind Go chess algorithm had two phases, right? The first phase was learning from historical data, all the records of human players' experience with the chess, right? And then the phase two is more advanced AI. DeepMind only tells the AI the rules, and the AI plays the game by itself, and it quickly figure out the game. Within a day, it become a better player than the first version, which studied all the human players' historical records. So when you look at that, you have to be impressed. These are intelligence coming up, in the example you just used, right? When the AI can develop algorithm itself, like when they can become programmer itself, probably their learning will be even faster. So I would say in many areas we will see this intelligence will come, and most likely they can replace people to be more efficient. But the human world, especially in the context of a human interaction, will still will be very, very difficult, very, very complex for machine to try to understand. What do you think?
Really quite interesting. Did you look at what are your views of quantum computing now, or quantum information science? Do you think quantum computing is real now, and it will come into fruition, let's say within 10 years or 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, looks like it will come up, because for China, for US, right, lots of countries have put in a lot of resources into that direction. So I think this probably will be mostly a engineering issue, and for engineering issue, it can always be solved by human efforts. It's not a, like when you try to accelerate the speed of a computation, right? That's more of an engineering issue than a science issue. And so I think it's a very likely to happen actually quite quickly.
Okay, so what would the world? So this is my last future sort of oriented question. What would the world look like from a technology standpoint by 2030? Winston is in New York, and you're managing this venture capital company, and you're embedded in New York University, and so on. What will your minute-by-minute experience be for the first 10 minutes when you get up in the morning, or the first hour?
Yeah, no, I would say first it will be data visualization, right? We will see data more vividly going forward, maybe even more efficiently. Today first thing we do, we open up turn on the smartphone and just starting to check the messages we missed, right? And down the road, in the metaverse, all the data we need to know probably will be much more vivid, visible, more interactive, right in front of us, right? And we do not need huge, cumbersome devices to get into that 3D device, to get into that 3D virtual space. Instead, we can use our eyes, or using very simple device, and we can walk in out of the metaverse, which is a seamless integration of the physical and the virtual spaces. And that's how we started the day. We see all the data that we need to know, and then the AI probably even knows better about what we should know, and those data will be presented in visualized fashion. So that will be the first, data visualization, and the second is sort of the human interaction. It's still back to this interactive concept, right? That's really the future, because everyone wants to interact, either for content creation or just for social interaction, right? So for the future social network, it will be much more immersive. It'll be much more immersive. Maybe I have a avatar that's really close to the real me, or we have a 3D image that's really close to the real me, and that image, right, can travel smoothly in the virtual spaces to interact with other people, just like the physical me is traveling through the physical world to meet with other physical people. But I think it will be a higher level of interaction in that future internet.
So that's an interesting prediction, and definitely, I think people can envision that, something that's a little bit more immersive from a visualization standpoint and interaction standpoint, and
right,
have a virtualized version of you representing you, which means there could be 100 instances of Winston around the world interacting.
Exactly.
Coming back, summarizing, right? And you can use some kind of advanced version of a language model or a transfer model, fusion model, summarizing all of these conversations and what's relevant and what's noise, so to speak, right? So
correct.
Okay, yes. So one last question is, what are your recommendations for the audience?
Yeah, no, I think data explosion is here. So instead of trying to grab as much information as possible, we have to be smarter in learning. And I find myself, like, every day still try to figure out what's the better way to learn about the new things, right? Not like you, Stephen. I still need to sleep. I know you don't have to sleep, but even in that case, right, you have double workable hours, but the data explosion is exponential, right? So I think today everyone needs to figure out, how can we continue to improve our learning skills, and be smart about dealing with this changing world where data explodes exponentially. And I think that's the issue that everyone has to think about, and we need to kind of remain as a human, right? So instead of trying to say, I try to get as much as possible, we have to ask the question, what is the best way to organize the society to handle this data explosion?
Well, let me reflect on that question
please.
by your answer.
A
little bit of data. So in my keynotes now, I say that, and this is kind of like a back of an envelope calculation, that we have about 10 exabytes of data points per day, right?
Right.
So that's 10 billion data points per day. That's an exabyte of data, right? So and to sort of quantify it in a way that people can relate to, estimated that there's 7 billion grains of sand on the earth. So
exactly. Another way to say is like the latest iPhone, right? Maybe may have 1 T memory, right? That's a very small fraction of that, the number you used.
Yeah, and in fact, then over the year, then that means there'll be roughly 5 zettabytes of data. That's 5 trillion billion data points. So you have all these data points, and then the question is, a lot of it's noise. How do you filter out to what's important or relevant?
Exactly.
You care about, and that's going to be a problem. And that's something that I think you're recommending, is that there's so much data out there. You got to figure out what are the things that you got to pay attention to, right? So
exactly, yeah. So you have to be conscious about your learning method, and then you talk to other smart people, right? Meet with other leaders, to figure out what's the latest, the best practice.
Right, or an avatar of Winston that's doing all this filtering for you because it knows you, right?
Exactly, and that avatar doesn't have to sleep.
So, Winston, thank you for coming in and sharing all your insights with our audience. You just have a marvelous background, and you're continuing to make so many contributions in so many different areas. And, you're just outstanding in the work you're doing. So thank you for sharing so much with our audience.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.